So the story begins in Poland. Of course, everyone who lived in Poland in 1939, there were threats, that there was a possibility. They knew that the Germans were planning to invade. They certainly didn't realize how quickly the Polish defenses would crumble, or that the Soviets would invade so soon afterward. All Polish citizens had to face the onslaught of the violence of these two invading armies and had to make decisions. And this story is very much about decisions, for my way of looking at it, at least. And first among those decisions was where they should stay or where they should move. That is, those people who, by chance of where the border ended up, were on the German side. Should they stay on the German side? Those on the Soviet side, should they stay under Soviet occupation or try and go back? And in many cases, families were split. If you think about that, this is September 1st, this is the start of the academic year. There were still people who were coming back from vacations, and part of the family made it back and part didn't. Or students had left for school and were on one side of the border, whereas the rest of their family was on the other border, was on the other side. So all sorts of people had to decide where to go and whether to stay and what their chances were. And this question was particularly rife for Polish Jews. So as I say, this is, everyone was facing these same problems, but Polish Jews had particular issues at stake here. Now, no one knew, including Adolf Hitler, in the fall of 1939, what would happen. Nobody knew what kind of death and destruction was going to come yet in the coming years. But Polish Jews read newspapers. They knew what the Nazis had been saying about Jews. They knew what had happened to Jews inside the Reich, inside the expanding Nazi Germany and the areas that came under its control. And they certainly knew that, for example, Polish Jews had been expelled. Those who didn't have German citizenship had been expelled across the border into Poland very cruelly without any warning. They knew about the Reichspogrom known as Kristallnacht. So they had some idea about what the Germans would be bringing with them. And they faced this choice whether to stay in their homes. That is, if we look back at that map for a moment, you'll see that slightly larger part of Poland went to the Germans, slightly smaller part, and the same thing Jewish in terms of the 3.2 million Jews in Poland, slightly more ended up on the German side, slightly fewer on the Soviet side. So should they stay there or should they try and cross over? And especially in the first months after the war, there was hardly a border. It was very easy to get across. And so all sorts of families are deliberating and trying to decide where they should end up. And for us, looking back, seems fairly obvious that it would be better not to be under the Germans. But of course, they didn't have the information that we have now. And I think we can also understand that for most of us, home feels safer than any place else. Around our homes, we have our support systems. We know how to get what we need. We know who to go to for help. We know where to get supplies. Whereas crossing a border, going into a new territory, even if we know people there, is going to be disorienting, is going to be destabilizing, is going to break us away from our support systems. And so most people, most Polish Jews made the decision to stay exactly where they were. We don't know the precise number of those who chose to cross over these new borders. Some of the estimates range from 500,000 at the uppermost to possibly 200,000 at the lower numbers. Some have gone even lower than that, but still significant numbers. Even the low numbers are a significant number of people, but percentage-wise, maybe 15% of the population, not enormous, clearly. In many cases, families met together to discuss this issue. It wasn't just an individual decision, but families decided who should go. Should they all go? In many cases, the decision was made that, say, all the men should go. The Germans clearly weren't going to do anything to women and children. They would be safe, but maybe the men might be forced to go to labor or something like that. Maybe they would be safer on the Soviet side. Or if a given family had someone who might have written something against the Germans once, there was a list. They knew this because these people were being arrested. So that person should get out first, and then maybe tell the rest of the family, decide, should they all follow afterward? In some families, the decision was made to send all the young people, not by gender, but by age. Maybe the young people will be able to find a way to live in this new territory, but the old folks it's going to be too hard, language, culture, jobs, they're just going to stay put unless the young people tell them to come. So all sorts of families met to make different decisions. And it was an ongoing discussion. That's the other thing that I really noticed when I was looking at the documentation and the stories that people told, is it wasn't one meeting, but again and again, people talking about it. And you get that sense a little bit in this diary entry from David Sherekoviak, who was in the Łódź ghetto when he was writing. We are still hesitating. So he's writing about this daily, the ways in which his family is grappling with, and the rumors they're hearing. This family went across, and this is what they said, but this other family, they went across and then they came back. So they're processing the information they're getting and trying to make a decision, and tragically, his family never left. So that's the first decision point. Those who chose to cross over then were in Soviet territory and had to adjust just as the residents of that area were adjusting at the same time. So remember, a whole bunch of Polish citizens, Jews among them, were already living in the part of Poland that had been taken over by the Soviets, and they mostly stayed there, and they faced this rapid onslaught of Sovietization. And Sovietization went into all spheres of life. So the most obvious among them were economic spheres, the nationalization of all industry, agriculture, large holdings, buildings, etc. But also education. All of instruction switched overnight pretty much from Polish to Ukrainian or Belarusian because the two areas that were taken became Western Belarus and Western Ukraine. So children's schools changed, the rules at work changed, all of this praise for Stalin, which comes up in some of these quotes that I have here. These types of oversight, supervision, denunciation that were a regular part of Soviet life were exported into this new territory. This was a great opportunity, by the way, for Stalin. The revolution was now 20 years old. They had figured out what it was they were trying to do. It proceeded in fits and starts, but by 1939, they knew what the USSR was, and they were ready to expand. And this was their chance. This was a place to experiment and to sort of all of a sudden, overnight, do what had taken 20 years and with all sorts of fits and starts, and change this into their vision of a communist country. And so that's what they did. And it was, in every way, it was difficult and a shock to the Polish population. It was also just the loss of their sovereignty, the loss of all their money, because zloty were worth nothing overnight and people had to buy rubles, but they couldn't use zloty, or in some cases they could, but they were worth a lot less. So people's lives changed in every way. And this is the residents. The refugees, those who had chosen to cross the border, were living through all of these same aspects of Sovietization, but were doing so as homeless refugees. That is, they were living in synagogue buildings. They were living on the street. They were trying to find work, but they often couldn't get residence permits or work permits. They were trying to build new lives at the same time as this area was undergoing this rapid change. And for many of them, it was impossible. And so we do know, again, from testimonies, but we don't have any idea of the exact numbers, that people went back. They gave up. They said, I tried it in Soviet territory, but they were sending letters back and forth to their family, and it didn't sound so bad under the Germans. Sure, it was hard at the beginning, but once the occupation regime came in and the fighting started, okay, ghettos, they didn't sound that bad in early 1940. So people chose to come back on their own steam in some cases. In one story was of an award-winning swimmer who actually swam back in order to get there in a hurry to be back with his family. However, at a certain point, they could no longer make a choice on their own. That is, after some months and after the Soviets had really installed their regime and created elections, quote unquote elections, Soviet-style elections, wherein there was a slate that people were forced to vote for, and they got in trouble if they didn't go to the polls, and the annexation of these territories, at that point, the Soviet authorities suddenly noticed and started to pay attention to the refugees. And this led to deportation. But first, the refugees were given a choice, and they thought that it was an actual choice. They were told, you can stay here in the Soviet Union. Mother Russia has taken you in. We have welcomed you. Father Stalin is ready to take you in and give you citizenship. But if you accept Soviet citizenship, you're going to have to move away from these border areas, which is the areas where they've been living, which is where all the Polish Jews were. They'd have to move about 200 kilometers further into Soviet territory where there was more need for workers. But then they would have Soviet citizenship. Or if they didn't want to stay, they could sign up for repatriation and be returned to the German-held Polish territories. So another decision point, this one a very formal one where they actually had to sign forms. And most of the refugees chose to return. Again, it sort of boggles the mind from our perspective to think about, but they did so based on conversations, based on knowledge, these letters they were receiving. The winter from 1939 to 1940 was especially cold. They were very miserable. They hadn't really settled in on the whole. And so the majority of them signed up for repatriation, not realizing, first of all, that this was a test and that they failed the test, and also not realizing that the Germans were never going to take in more Jews. The Germans already had many, many more Jews than they knew what to do with. We're already trying to figure out what to do with that Jewish population, and we're not going to allow more into their territories that they occupied and held. So the result of failing this test from the perspective of Soviet Union was deportation east. So these Polish Jews, these refugees, were suddenly, they filled out the paperwork in February and March of 1940. And in June 13th and 14th of 1940, so some months later, all of a sudden, the NKVD, the precursor of the KGB, showed up, and they were given 15 minutes to pack and told they were going home. So they packed up just what they needed. It's summer, they only need a little bit of their belongings, and they board these trains mostly rather optimistically. We're going home, we're going to be with our families again. Most of them hadn't been in the Soviet Union long enough to understand its logic. Now, they had seen previous deportations. That is, by June of 1940, 3 different waves of deportations of Polish citizens had already taken place in these newly annexed Soviet territories. So they had already seen people being picked up by the NKVD, put on trains, and taken away. But mostly those people were in certain categories that were deemed dangerous, such as religious leaders, political leaders, large landholders, bankers, people who had financial power. So they thought most of these people, well, that's not me. I'm not that kind of person. So they didn't really understand until they realized by looking out the small windows in these freight cars that they were going east instead of west. So that was the experience of deportation. And it's something that they write about a great deal and talk about a lot in their testimonies and their memoirs. In some ways, it doesn't last that long, given the whole span of their war experience. But that sort of realization of what's happening to them and the experience of being deported was so horrific. And one of the things that they often say is that at that moment on the train, and also when they got there, because they were taken to labor camps, they thought that they had made the wrong decision, and they began to write to their relatives in the ghettos, asking them to send food and clothing. And they did. We actually have records of, people describing the long johns they got in the mail from the Warsaw Ghetto, and the tea that was sent to them from the Ludmir Ghetto. I mean, things that you wouldn't imagine, but everyone thought, not just the people in these labor camps, but also the Jews in the ghettos thought, oh, those poor Nebuch, they're stuck. What's going to happen to them? They'll never get out. No one ever gets out of the gulag. They weren't precisely in the gulag in the way that we often think of it. They were often in labor camps. And this is a drawing of a labor camp by a 14-year-old. After he left, he drew the camp that his family was in. So what's significant about these particular camps they were in is that it was just them. The other Polish Jews who had been deported earlier were often mixed with Soviet gulag populations, but these people were usually in family camps. Sometimes they were mixed with Catholic Poles, but often it was just Jewish Poles in these camps. So they lived in barracks with their families. It wasn't what we think of as typically as a labor camp, which is separate sex. And they did have to work. And most of them were utterly unprepared for the type of work they were asked to do. These were shoemakers, homemakers, and they were being asked to work in forestry, to work in coal mining. They weren't being given any of the equipment or the uniforms, the clothing that they needed for the temperature, for safety. Many of them died of on-the-job accidents and of malnutrition, because the food rations were very, very low in these labor camps, and you only got any food if you met the norm. This is a very Soviet gulag term, but every day there was a norm. You had to cut that many trees, or if your job was cutting off the branches of trees, you had to debranch a certain number of trees. There were norms that were set. But these were set for a gulag population that was mostly male, and that many of them had some of these skills, whereas this population didn't know what they were doing and often couldn't meet their norms, and thus were getting less and less nutrition over the course of their time in these camps. They were told by the guards that they would never leave, and they believed that, and they thought this was the end. But in fact, it surprisingly to everyone was not. In the late summer of 1941, after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the population, all of the Poles, Jewish and non-Jewish, all the Polish citizens who were in labor installations were suddenly amnestied. I put the word amnesty up there. It's somewhat of a controversial term because amnesty suggests they'd actually done something wrong, whereas they hadn't actually. But nonetheless, it's the term usually used in the literature. And they were amnestied because of the intervention of the British. That is, after the invasion of the Soviet Union, all of a sudden Stalin did want to follow up with Churchill. Previously, Churchill had been trying to get Stalin into the war, and he wasn't interested. But after the invasion in June of 1941, he was. And the British were able to pull out a few agreements from the Soviets in order to start working together as allies. And one of them was based on the request of the Polish government in exile, which was sitting in London at this time, to amnesty all Polish citizens and to allow for the formation of a Polish army, which would fight with the allies. A Polish army would be formed in the Soviet Union and go out and fight. So kind of overnight, they find themselves free, but they can't go home. There's a war being fought right in their homes. They don't want to stay in these terrible camps. So they mostly go south. They go south into Central Asia, into the Stans. And they do so for a number of reasons. They think it's going to be warmer. They think there's going to be more food because there's a longer growing season. There's a childhood book that a lot of people read that was very influential, called Tashkent City of Bread. It's a terrible book, by the way, and I don't recommend it. Miserable book, but nonetheless, they were somewhat nostalgic about it. But mostly they went because others were going. They heard that their relatives or people from their same town were converging in Central Asia. And so they wanted to be with people of their kind. They'd been so isolated in these camps. They wanted to be with others like themselves. And so they moved into Central Asia. And they were moving there in the summer of fall of 1941, along with millions of Soviet citizens who were either self-evacuating or evacuating themselves into those very same territories. And for some of the same reasons. That is, it was believed that it would be a better place to spend the war and safer. But that meant that the resources in this already somewhat underdeveloped area were absolutely pushed to their limit, and particularly in that all of the medical resources and food was being sent to the military. This is the point at which the Soviets are losing the war. They're in a desperate situation. They need more and more men, and they need to equip and supply those men. So there was actually, instead of the conditions they expected, there was a great deal of hunger. And because of the better temperatures, there were also endemic diseases and pandemic diseases. So many of the refugees write about the deaths that took place once they got to Central Asia. And that picture on the bottom right shows this family, Polish Jewish family, burying their patriarch. So it's these women who are left now in Central Asia. The father, the husband, has died, leaving them on their own together. And they write with surprise that in many cases, the death rate was higher once they got to Central Asia than had they stayed up north in the camps. Actually, there were deaths in the camps, but actually they were dying at higher rates because of the disease and the hunger in the south. So on the one hand, really very difficult, and especially the first year. They arrive in 1941. The Soviets it's a disaster. They're losing this war. The population's moving around. They're trying to rebuild industry in the interior so that they can equip the military. It's a very difficult time. And no one was the slightest bit interested in helping these refugees. And they were sort of on the very bottom of the ration list. If there was anyone who was going to be helped, it was going to be Soviet citizens. But mostly these Polish citizens aren't getting a lot of help. They're living in the streets. They're being preyed upon by, there was a whole kind of industry of robbery, which grew up around the train stations, where people would literally strip people bare while they were sleeping in these train stations, waiting for the next train. They would wake up without shoes, without jackets, without their bags, and with nothing, and laying on the ground outside of these train stations. While they're trying to move to the next place where they've heard there might be family or friends who are awaiting them there, or people from their youth group. So a very difficult time, especially for that first year. However, on the other hand, one of the effects of the war was the level of kind of oversight and supervision that had existed for the whole Soviet population, for the whole Soviet period, began to lift a little bit. That is, the NKVD no longer had the manpower and the resources to look quite as closely at what people were doing in their private lives. Many of them had to fight. And so they couldn't, and also the population was moving. It was harder to keep track of. It doesn't mean that the whole Soviet system broke down, but it means that there was a little more room for cultural and religious activities than there had been in the whole Soviet period. And for this population, when they were in the labor camps, they were very much overseen. Everything was overseen. And it was very hard for them to practice their religion or do any cultural activities at all. But now it becomes more possible. And this picture on the top right shows a group of Polish Jews baking matzah, appropriate to the season that we're entering. And what's interesting about it, I think, is that they're not hiding. They're out there publicly. They're taking a picture. There's clearly smoke going up from this oven. They're not hiding what they're doing there. They're proudly baking matzah with a community of people together in order to celebrate the holiday of Passover. One of the other changes that happened over time the longer that they spent in the Soviet Union, is that they began to receive packages. Again, partly because of the desperate situation of the Soviet Union during this period, they began to open up this country, which had been rather closed down, in order to bring in, of course, we know about the Lend-Lease system, where the US government was sending in equipment and foodstuffs, but also to allow individuals to receive private packages. So American Jews could send individual packages if they could find the address of their family member, of their Polish Jewish relatives who were someplace in the Soviet Union. They could send packages there. It was through a complicated means of companies that would send them there. And there were also institutions that set up in order to help with that. And one of those was the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee. So this photograph on the top left shows packages being prepared in Palestine in order to be brought via land to Iran, where they would be then put on ships out of Pahlavi and into Central Asia and then be delivered. All of these various efforts, of course, required that the organizations not only give to their own people, that is the Polish Jews in this case, but they had to also provide a certain amount of goods for the Soviet population at large. And one of the ways that they did that, in this case, that you can see there are these large bags, which are clearly like staples, and then the smaller packages actually have individual names on them. So those are going to families whom they know about, who they found out about. And there's all these lists, this is in the archives, going around. That the JDC has one list of Polish Jews who are in the Soviet Union, and the World Jewish Congress has a different list, and the Aguda, the Orthodox Rabbinate, has a different list, and they're all sharing their list so that they can try and expand them so that they can help more people. There's this effort to send packages. Another, and that begins really in 43. What also happened after 43, and 43 is sort of the turning point when the Soviets begin to win the war instead of to lose the war, is that whereas up until that point, there had been sort of a compromise to allow the Polish government in exile, to have a little bit of control and to form their army. At that point, the Soviets kicked out the Polish government in exile and their representatives and brought in their own Polish leaders. And so they opened schools, for example, and you can see this is a school of children, Catholic and Jewish, and it's Bukhara, Warsaw. So they're in Bukhara, in the Uzbek SSR, and they're planning to go to Warsaw. So this class is getting ready, but they are, this is a Sovietized Polish school. So the amnesty period goes on. After the war ends, it continues. That is, these Polish Jews are still sitting there waiting to hear what's going to happen. And finally, in 1946, Stalin decided that actually it would be a good thing to send these Polish citizens back. There's some conversation about why that was, and we can talk about it more. We don't know precisely why, but in the summer of 1946, they are given the option of repatriation. The vast majority of them accept it and do go back to Poland. There are a few who stay. Some of them are stayed because they married local people and they couldn't get out the rest of their family. And once again, they board trains just as they had for their deportation, but this time it's by choice. This is the Yarmush family sitting in front of you. You can see the Polish Eagle. It's a Polish train, which is going to take them back to their homes. It's a moment, a huge moment for them. They don't really know what has happened. As soon as the war ended, or as soon as each progressive area got liberated, they were sending letters back to their folks. You know, what happened? Where's the family? How's mom? Mostly they weren't getting answers to those letters, but they didn't really know what had happened. Or even if they heard, say, a neighbor picked up a letter and said, actually, your family didn't survive. They didn't realize that it wasn't just their family, but their whole Jewish community, their whole town, their whole civilization, in fact, had been killed off. So they go back with some optimism. They believe it's going to be better, and they believe it might be possible to rebuild. And most of these Polish Jews who arrive back in Poland originally think they're going to try and build what existed there before. They quickly find out about the Holocaust, about the huge destruction. They also find out that Poland, which was already a fairly anti-Semitic country when they left, had become more so because of the German occupation, because of the genocide, and in fact that they're not very welcome. And we can see this in the top right-hand picture. On the one hand, one man is showing two different Yiddish newspapers. These are being produced in Łódź, in Lodz, after the war. So a sense of that rebuilding, of trying to bring back their culture. But on the other hand, the man next to him is holding a gun, because in order for them to produce these newspapers, they have to be able to protect themselves. We also see the populations coming back together. That is, the Polish Jews who had left and those who stayed and managed to survive in Poland meet each other once again. And we see that in this picture, and this is like Dr. Judd's work. But here we have a man in the Soviet uniform. He's come back with the Red Army. He's repatriating, and he meets a Polish Jewish Holocaust survivor, and they marry. This is their marriage photo after the war. And they stayed in that case. They wanted to live in post-war Poland. But many people didn't stay, and the photograph at the top shows children in a DP camp. And one of the very strong recollections of many people who worked in the DP camps, that is the staff, is that the first children they saw were when the Polish repatriates came, the Polish Jewish repatriates. All of the other survivors, those who survived in Europe, came alone. As young people often, but without families. And the repatriates actually came sometimes in intact families. So it was sort of a celebration to see them. And then the final photo here shows the efforts that many began to leave after they came to the DP camps, then they went elsewhere. And this is a photo taken on the Exodus, this famous ship of Holocaust survivors that was turned away, that couldn't get in because of the British to Palestine and had to go elsewhere. When we tell that story, usually, and certainly when the newspapers at the time talked about that, they talk about Holocaust survivors. They talk about people who were behind barbed wire, being forced to go to Cyprus or forced to go back to Europe where they'd seen their families murdered. Some of them were, but actually the majority of them had spent the war in the Soviet Union. And that leads me to my final topic, which is about memory. Sort of where does this story fit in? How do we talk about it? And why don't we know more about it? This story has been very much marginalized from histories of the Holocaust. Often people who were, and we talked about this a little bit in the class earlier, who were part of this group didn't feel that they were welcome in Holocaust survivor groups. They didn't feel that their stories, that they could tell their stories after the war. And the same is true to a great degree also in Soviet history of the war and in Polish history of the war, that they didn't really fit anywhere in terms of the history or in terms of the memory. And one illustration of that is this is, if any of you have been to Warsaw, this is a giant monument in Warsaw. It was put up in 1995, so after the communists were gone, and it's a monument about Soviet deportation of Poles. So you can see it's this death cart, and it's just filled with crosses. It goes on, because from the Polish memory perspective, deportation into the Soviet Union was a death sentence, was oppressive, was a genocide, and was equal to what the Germans did. What the Germans did and what the Soviets did in Poland was the same, and it was all against the Polish nation. Now, on the one hand, the creators of this monument recognized that there were some Jews there also. In fact, there were about 30% of the deportees were Jews. So having this one matseva, this one Jewish monument, doesn't really cover that. But they recognized that there were some Jews. But on the other hand, the way they tell the story is not how Jews would tell that story, because from the Jewish perspective, Soviet deportation ended up being salvation. So if there were a Jewish monument, and there's not anywhere yet, any monuments to this story, it would look very different. I don't know what it would look like, but it's something I think about. So that takes me through really the basics. There's so much more. There's so many other stories, but I hope this gives you a sense of what this wartime experience was like. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Was the memory at all of like the pogroms, part of testimonies in your research? Were people apprehensive about going into Russia because of like past violence against Jews?
Huh. An interesting question. You know what they often do write about, not so much the pogroms, is they write about the First World War, and they compare. The German troops were well dressed and they followed orders and they were easy to work with. They told us what the rules were during the First World War, and they didn't oppress people. The Red Army during the First World War, they didn't even have boots. They didn't know what they were doing. They got lost. Like, which country do we want to be in? We think the Germans are more safe. So especially older people often refer not so much to anti-Jewish violence as just to the chaos of the Bolsheviks in their early years.
I'm wondering, since you were drawing on different forms of testimony, if the modality of the testimony or the time of the testimony shaped the memory and narratives that got resulted, particularly with those individuals who left, the interview at 14 and then the memoir at 52 when the interview was whatever.
Yeah, that is definitely something I would be interested in looking more closely at. I don't have too many people who I had a series that I could go through, but there are a few examples of that. And generally, and many of you know that historians tend to appreciate earlier testimonies more, but also, especially the early post-war testimonies are really short, really factual, often just 2 paragraphs. This was my wartime experience, and really testimony in the very much in the legal sense, whereas the Shoah Foundation interviews go on, and people can talk about their lives, and so they're very different modalities, but also the setting that they're in certainly matters, and the kinds of questions that they're asked. So I was able to trace one child, a couple of children. I wrote one article, a couple of children who I had their testimony. They were evacuated with the Polish army that was allowed to leave via Iran. So there were some children taken out, and so the Polish government in exile interviewed them. So we have their 1942 very brief testimonies, not in their own handwriting. So it's already mediated. It's somebody in the Polish government in exile writing it down. And then later they were interviewed, say, by the Shoah Foundation or by Yad Vashem. I haven't done enough analysis that I can do something like Hannah Poland-Galai has done to really talk about the different ecologies of witnessing. But I do think that is a good direction to go in. And what I did see in these testimonies is that the childhood ones are in the first person plural. All of the children write about what happened to us. We were deported. They think in terms of family. And by the time they're adults, they're writing about their own experience. So that's one obvious difference. Yes.
Yeah, so after many of the Polish Jews went to Central Asia and left the camps, what was the future of those labor camps? You said that some had kind of solely been for those Polish Jews. What happened to them after a lot of that population left? Were they repurposed and kind of part of the Gulag, or how did they exist past that? Were they just kind of closed down? It seemed like it'd be a waste of resources for the Soviets to just not use them past that.
Yes, and also the NKVD was actually really eager to keep them open because otherwise they would go to the front. So they needed to show that they were really busy in the Gulag and couldn't possibly leave. But fortunately, there were a lot of populations being moved into the Gulag. So even like sometimes they describe when they arrive that there's still bed bugs there. That is to say, the people who left before have only left a couple weeks ago. Otherwise, the bed bugs would have moved on. So there's always a new population to move in. And in the midst of the war, ethnic Germans who were in the Soviet Union get moved into the Gulag. Some of the other Central Asian populations get moved around. There's just a constant movement of people through. But it's also the case, and this is something that Gulag scholars think about, that some of these camps, like especially these camps, with these Polish Jews in them, who weren't actually producing anything of use. Like they were just a re-education scheme. They were a way to keep these people apart from the population, to show them where they belonged and where they didn't belong. They weren't, unlike some of the other camps that were labor camps that actually achieved something, they were kind of busy work. Terrible busy work.
Were some of those populations ever conscripted to the front? Were any Polish Jews ever taken to the soldiers or?
Yes.
Okay.
And they were taken into a number of different armies. That's a whole other
Right.
area. But yes, some of them were put into the Red Army against their will sometimes, or sometimes they volunteered. There was also later, starting in 43, there was a Polish division of the Red Army, which was supposed to recruit Poles. So some of the Jews got into that one. And then some of them got into very small numbers because this one was much more anti-Semitic. But the Polish government and exiles army, which left in 42, some Jews managed to get into, but chiefly if they had some skill like musicians or medical skills, not so much just regular recruits. Yeah.
How many Poles do you think just remained in Central Asia? The ones that intermarried or found a reason to stay there?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't think it's really high numbers, but one does hear these stories. It's hard to know some of these stories, like when I was, I did research in Kazakhstan, and people would like retell these stories, and it's hard to tell if they're urban myths or not. Like, oh, I heard about someone, and when his grandmother died, she said, oh, I didn't want to tell you before, but actually I'm Jewish. And could you bury me in this other cemetery rather than in the Muslim cemetery where the whole rest of the family has been going? What? But it's just hard to know how common that was. I don't think it's very high numbers. There was an additional repatriation in 56. So most left in 46. In 55, 56, another 15,000 Polish citizens were allowed to leave. Most of them were Jews. Some of those people were stuck in they had been put in the gulag because they were Zionists or for some other reason. So they couldn't get out in 46 because they were incarcerated. And some of them thought they would stay. Like they made a life there, but then they decided by 56 that they didn't want to stay. So after that point, I think it's very small numbers, but I don't think we'll ever know exactly. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about the memory and the post-war experience? So, for example, what extent do those people see themselves as Holocaust survivors, even though they not survived the camps?
Yeah.
What extent they participated in shaping the memory, and how they related or interacted with survivors, other survivors who came from other places, who spent the war in other places?
Yeah, this is something I did research on. It didn't end up going into the book because there wasn't room, but it's something I was trying to figure out. There's a mix. That is, some people consider themselves Holocaust survivors, 100%. And often, if you hear their oral testimonies, they really put that part forward. Maybe they had one interaction with a German soldier before they left, but that's their Holocaust experience, and they're going to talk about how terrible that was and how the German soldier drowned their brother in one case. So he had the Holocaust. That was his Holocaust. Then he went to the Soviet Union. Others of them completely say no. There are Holocaust survivors. My husband was a Holocaust survivor. There's one woman in the testimony who says, it's very poignant. She says, I thought I had it bad. And then I met, my husband, and I found out what suffering really was. So then she said, after that, she says, I didn't talk no more. That was the end of her telling her story. She seemed like the kind of person who actually talked a lot, but it's a rhetorical bent. So it's a mix, I would say, in terms of what they consider themselves, and it also where they went. Some of them talk about trying to join Holocaust sort of survivor organizations and not being welcomed in them. But others of them found other ways of being part of communities of memory. And one of the ways that they could do that was through Landsmannschaft and through communities that were formed around towns. So it didn't matter when you left a certain town. If you all came from Sokolov Podolsky, you all had that in common, and you could all be part of memorializing that town together. And so that's one way in which they could be fully engaged in the process. So it goes in all different directions, and some people are still, very hurt about the way that their families were treated by the survivor community, and others of them really integrated and were parts of those communities.
And what about the compensation of Germany, the ability for, what's the word?
Claims conference, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, so for most of the post-war period, these people were not eligible. But with the fall of the Soviet Union, the Claims Conference changed its rules to make room for Soviet survivors. And these people fit much more in the category of Soviet survivors. And so some of them were able to claim compensation belatedly if they still needed it at that point. A lot of people already had settled into their lives and didn't need it as much at that point. But there's also some people who did fit in. For example, those people who left a little bit later, if they spent 4 months under German occupation in Poland before they crossed the border to the Soviet Union, they would qualify for compensation from the German government. So there were ways of, sometimes they fit in to one degree or another. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about Soviet Jews and to what extent do Polish Jews meet up with Soviet Jews? Was there anyone who went to Azerbaijan?
Mhm.
Maybe
Yeah. So they do meet Soviet Jews, and they're very interested in them. And they write about them like anthropologists, like these strange creatures. Oh, they know Yiddish, but they don't know anything about traditions. You know, they're interested in Soviet Jews, particularly Ashkenazi Soviet Jews. They have some interactions also with non-Ashkenazi Soviet Jews, Bukharan, Mountain Jews, Persian, Georgian, others. Whom they're also somewhat interested in from an anthropological perspective, but they don't have the same connection. But there's some, again, some very beautiful stories about people helping each other, about Yiddish, for example, being sort of a secret language that would allow people to, oh, will you help me? If you say it, I'm Amcha. And if the Soviet Jew understands that, that is, I'm of your people, then you'll be safe. What I have noticed is that although the Polish Jews are extremely interested in Soviet Jews in their testimonies and wartime memoirs, to the degree that there aren't as many for obvious reasons, don't say one word about the Polish Jews. They were not on their radar. They didn't make a big impression on them. Most of them have nothing to say about them. So it was this kind of cultural interchange, but kind of one-sided. And I think it's an interesting area that people could go further with, for sure. But nobody went as far as Azerbaijan that I've noticed.
so we talked earlier about the movement down south towards Tajikistan or Kent or other places.
Yeah.
And I think you said it was related to weather, the ability to get food. Were there also other considerations deciding to go that direction? Going to Palestine or?
Yeah, there are. I ran into a couple testimonies of Zionists who did have some idea that maybe they could escape that way, get out of the Soviet Union, but they never did. The mountains, the KGB, the NKVD, that people could not get out. It wasn't actually possible to do so. But there is a little bit of conversation. There was one, I'll show my own side here, leader who wrote about like trying to get together a band of people to get out, but it never went anywhere.
My grandfather. Well,
Okay.
Eat dinner.
Okay. Did you
He
get out?
actually means and Iran.
Okay, but if you went out with the Polish government, then it's easier to get to Palestine. But people getting out on foot,
Polish army.
yeah, right, with the Polish army, yeah, that way they actually directly took them to Palestine, indirectly.
So that's different. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a different group, yeah. But I'm interested in hearing about it. Yeah. Thank you all.
So I was about to ask something, but I was basically like, I was about to ask, couldn't they go south and try to hop on a train to the mall?
Yeah, so the borders were hermetically sealed, but there was this evacuation, or actually two evacuations of Polish citizens, mostly in the military, and a few orphans who were taken with them, who were allowed to go out until Stalin changed his mind and didn't let the third group out. Thank you for all your questions.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Dr. Adler, for this really incredible, like historical work and research work, and like all the archival traces and figuring out the oral histories, and really giving us a way to think about memory and migration during this part of history that isn't always part of the bigger narrative that we hear. So thank you so much, and thank you all for coming. And if you have not already signed in, please do this. Will help us in this office and more events like this. So thank you all so much.
Thanks.